All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. I'm not sure if anyone else is going to join us. I know Brian said he was going to be late, but he was coming, and I guess we have two more other people. So the plan for tonight is finish the second half of attraction and then helping, which you saw was only one PowerPoint. It was updated, I think, 2 nights ago. Maybe that was last night. I'm losing track of time. So if you downloaded all of your slides really early in the semester, you'll want to re-download this last topic, just because I did add a little bit more information, but still pretty short. So if I remember correctly, though, we had gone through all of the first half of attraction. The last part was the golden rule with the Marquet face mask. We saw that? Okay, good. So that leads us then at the start of this one, which is talking about what roles do evolution and culture play on physical beauty and attraction. So go back to some of the things that we visited last week, a little bit more detail. Then we're going to look specifically at relationships, what makes a relationship rewarding. We'll define different types of love, and then finally we'll look at 3 things that foster love: attachment, equity, and disclosure. Just want to review quickly. It's been a little while. So remember the first half of attraction and liking, we talked about factors that influence not only what we like, but who we like. We like things and people that are close to us that we interact with at a predictable basis. We like what's familiar, like our name, and we did that demonstration. Also related to our name is what reminds us of ourselves, which of course our name also reminds us of ourselves. We also in that talked about the ownership effect, as well as that study about mirror recognition, where we actually prefer the mirror image of ourselves, because that's how we see ourselves. And then we spent just a few minutes talking about symmetry, facial symmetry, so it's a tongue twister, and why we actually have evolved a preference for symmetrical faces. The reason why that is because they're correlated with overall health. So they're what we call honest signals, and they actually signal to some extent, at least evolutionarily, it might not be for everybody in every instance, people that are going to be good to mate with. If you go back to evolutionary theory, the idea is you want to perpetuate your genes, put your genes in the gene pool. You're going to want to have a good mate. Well, it turns out that people with very symmetrical faces tend to have a better set of genes, just for lack of a more scientific explanation. It's correlated, especially in women, with chemicals, hormones that are important for sustaining pregnancy, like estrogen. Well, it also turns out that we have the reverse for what we dislike. So if you have kind of an initial preference for something, or even if you're neutral initially to how a song sounds or some product that's being advertised to you for the first time, with repetition you grow more and more fond of it. But if for any reason you dislike something, the more it's played or the more you expose yourself to it, the more you dislike it. In fact, if you remember about group influence, one of the group influence effects that we talked about was group polarization, where whatever leaning you have initially, whether you're conservative or liberal, and tell Martha she should go on the biology trip or Roger to invest in the stocks, remember that exercise? That it gets stronger with elaboration. Well, this isn't so much about elaboration, but it is about the extent that opinions get stronger, or likes get stronger, and dislikes get stronger with repeated exposure. Interestingly, that part of why we like people is not just these things, but that we actually, once we identify with somebody as part of our in-group, if you will, we actually tend to adjust our attitudes to reflect them more. So you see this play out sometimes in real life. So maybe you meet somebody and they have a distinctive way of talking or dressing, and then you find yourself, you develop a friendship, and maybe you adopt some of those characteristics, particular speech pattern or a new word that you never heard but they use all the time. That's part of aligning yourself to be like them. And essentially the receiving part of that says to them, well, they're like me, right? They're mimicking me. We talked about mimicry as a basis for empathy when we talked about mirror neurons. So that then makes the two stronger. Which actually raises a really interesting question. Do people who have spent a long time together actually start to look like one another? And that's the study that I want to show you next. Now you say, well, how can that be? People don't physically change what they look like. But actually, when we go through the study, and you'll see from the data, people start to embody each other. And part of embodiment is how you conduct yourself, the emotions you display. So even in something like a static picture, you'll start to actually change in a way that might make you a little bit more similar to the person that you've spent a long time around. So what they did in this study is have pictures of old people and young people. Some of them were real couples that were married, and some of them were randomly put together. They were not married, so they were strangers. So two independent variables, you had old people, some of them were married, some of them were strangers. Young people paired, some that were married, some that were strangers. Okay, so heterosexual couples. And they simply put the pictures up and asked the participants in the study, how similar do these people look to one another? Of course, they're not going to look that similar because it's a man and a woman, but the idea would be that if in fact we start to align our attitudes with time, those that are married and have spent a lot of time together, that is, old people that are married, should actually start to look more similar to one another, at least more similar than the other comparison groups, married and young or old and not married. And that's the hypothesis that they made. Think it works? Yes. And in fact, Mina, you are right. Let me put on my stars here. So here are married people who have spent a long time together. The thing you have to remember about this axis is that it's reverse scored. So lower scores mean more similar to one another, more similar looking. So it means that, yes, old people who are married are judged to look more alike than young people who are married. Because they've spent more time together, more time for that attitude of alignment. The reverse is true for people who are not married. And you might say, well, why is the reverse true? Maybe you wouldn't expect a significant difference if they were just strangers. And I'm not really sure how to explain the fact that young people look more similar, even as strangers, than people. It might be what we call an in-group effect, because the participants were young in this case. So if you were young, you're probably better able to tell young people apart. That is, they look less similar than old people, because old people being your out-group, remember that out-group homogeneity effect, all look the same to you. That might be what's going on, but this is the difference that's really important for the hypothesis. That yeah, if you're old and you spent a long time together, that is, you're married, start to look like one another. And these are just still pictures. And what happens is that you just start to change the expressions that you hold to match your partners. So the perceived effect is similarity.
I have a question.
Yes?
What makes, like, if we were all together, our DNA, all women in this national, we just have to get our medicines all the same.
Mm-hmm.
What does that?
Pheromones. Pheromones are chemicals, airborne chemicals that your body detects, and they're emitted when a female menstruates. So every other female's body detects them at some level. It's obviously not at the level of the brain, it's very primitive, and that then triggers your cycle. So a lot of species communicate just by smell. A pheromone is just a type of smell communication. We just always think about people's communication being determined by what we say and vision, but we also communicate by smell as well. Just like how you can recognize the smell of your significant other. Like they've done this great study where you put a bunch of t-shirts from all different males, if you're a female, and you smell them all, and like with some high amount of reliability, people can pick out the one from their partner. Smell communication. All right. Now that study always is kind of funny to me. Let's go back then just a step, and we talked a little bit about physical beauty when we talked about attraction in the last lecture. I put this slide up here because obviously the ideal standards of what's beautiful, especially in a woman, have changed, right? You look at these women depicted during the Renaissance in this painting, and you'd say, well, they're kind of fat, right? They're kind of overweight. But this is the ideal shape. In fact, historically, if you were overweight, it meant you had wealth. You had enough food to eat, right?
That's our problem.
So those of us who are overweight could be like, yeah, we just really have all the goods right here, literally. So it was a way to actually signal, honestly, that you had some kind of status. Well, of course, now we have different standards of beauty, but some of the same things that men find attractive about women still hold. Not overall weight, but things like that waist to hip ratio. You remember that? That 0.7 we talked about, where your waist should be 70% of your hips. So even though in early times men desired a more voluptuous female, they still have a smaller waist compared to their hips. In fact, they still conform to that 0.7 rule we talked about. Before we talk more about physical beauty, though, let's just talk about what's called the physical attraction stereotype, or attractiveness stereotype. And this is literally the idea that people who are beautiful or perceived as beautiful are better off, smarter, more friendly, nicer to be around, make more money, whatever things that you can think about good. If you associate somebody who's being beautiful, you probably associate goodness with them too. Which is the way we look at beautiful celebrities and we think they have this perfect life, right? Perfect lives. But here's the interesting thing. One thing it is that it's an illusionary correlation. We talked about that once before, where if you have something that's unusual, two things that are unusual, and let's say the media plays up on both of them, they can get erroneously linked in memory. We talked about that when we talked about, I think, where they highlight maybe the sexuality, a transgender person as committing some kind of crime. So then in our minds, you think, well, transgender people commit crimes. Or maybe most mass murderers we know are actually old white males. For some reason it's an African-American male. They'll prioritize that in the media coverage. And then you get the false assumption that African-American are more likely to commit mass murder because they highlight two things that are independent. That's an illusionary correlation. It also relates to the beautiful is better concept. Because what you have is beauty, that's a good thing. And you have all of these other positive attributes, which are also good things. And so we tend to combine good things. And so this is the false idea that somehow if you're beautiful and you're perceived as being beautiful, that your life is better off. And whatever dependent variable you use, whatever way you want to operationalize better, tends to hold. Better personality, you make more money, you're judged as being more friendly, judged to be smarter. Any of those things are correlated with beauty. Oops. Well, it's not a particularly accurate stereotype for the reasons we just taught, but there is a little bit of truth behind it, just the way most stereotypes have a grain of truth. Once a person knows that they're attractive, or that people judge them as being so beautiful, what happens is then it makes them more self-confident. And once you become more self-confident, you change your behaviors in a way that actually make them better or more desirable. It gives you the little added boost to maybe seek out a better job. So you maybe do make more money. Maybe it gives you the little added boost that you're more confident in class, which translates then to the teachers treating you in a more positive way, a little bit better grade. And so all of these things are really self-fulfilling prophecies. So to some extent, this is an accurate stereotype, but not really for the reasons that we think. It's really because once you know that you are something, in this case beautiful or attractive, it actually allows you to engage in that self-fulfilling cycle, something we've talked about before. We actually change then your fate as a result of knowing something positive about yourself. You actually go on to be more positive, engage in more positive behaviors. Does that make sense? This is the same reason why all of a sudden, let's say you get your hair cut, or you get a makeover, or you get your nails painted, it gives you a little bit of confidence. All of a sudden you feel like you're having a great day. Because what you've done essentially is become more confident. You've allowed then yourself to interact with the world and make this different set of attributions that you might not have made or that you would have made if you weren't feeling so good about yourself. So now we step back and talk a little bit about physical attraction. So we already know that, again, heterosexual men, when looking at women, tend to value the waist to hip ratio. Talked about that before, kind of the universal numbers, 0.7. There's some cultural variety, but most of it's around the 0.7 mark. Here's some other interesting things that universally, as well as historically across time, people tend to, or males tend to value with women in terms of what they look for in a romantic partner. Full lips, small chins, large eyes, We're going to talk about the rest of them in just a minute. But those three things right there, the full lips, the small chin and nose, and the large eyes, are all tied up in something called neoteny. Does you know what that word means? Okay. See it there, neotenized youth. Well, think about a baby animal, specifically a baby mammal, whether it be a sheep, a dog, a cat, or a baby human. Typically, they're pretty cute. But what is it about their face that makes them cute?
So small guys.
They have big eyes. They have cute little mouths. They have tiny button noses. So the idea of neoteny is that what men, adult men, actually prefer in a romantic partner replicates very youthful, youth-like features. That's the neoteny. And again, if you think about this from an evolutionary perspective, if the male strategy is to mate with as many females as possible because he can never ensure his paternity, that would be the best evolutionary strategy in terms of getting his genes in the gene pool, you should always try, or you should always prefer women who are at the most reproductive age, between 20 and 30. We talked about that once before. We talked about attraction. Well, in that case, then, women who are younger or look younger would be preferred. And that's probably why, then, heterosexual men have a preference overall for a neotenized look. But also where women tend to wear the most makeup. What features do we wear makeup on?
Eyes, cheeks, lips.
Eyes and mouth, primarily. Yeah, you can wear blush, which is interesting. That here. We don't particularly put a lot of makeup on our noses. We could all, think it's conventional, put dots on our noses. We don't do that. But we play up our eyes and lips. The reason why we do that, it actually makes us look like our eyes are bigger and our lips are fuller. It actually replicates the neotenized look that men find attractive. Always makes me rethink my makeup choice. Every time I give this lecture, I'm like, I will not wear eyeliner anymore. But it's a really interesting standard of beauty that we kind of, again, this idea of an honest signal that actually communicates something. It communicates youth, where men are to be attracted to more youthful women because they're the most likely to be reproductive. Now, in terms of the clear skin, I think that's pretty self-explanatory. Obviously, your skin condition gives you some indicator of your overall health. Hair is interesting because, again, it's correlated with overall health. The longer you can grow your hair and still look good is actually gives you some information about the genetic makeup, if you will, the health of the genome of the individual overall. So those people whose hair gets very brittle or doesn't grow beyond a certain length, on average are a little bit less reproductively healthful or overall healthful, which would correlate with reproduction, than those who are able to maintain very long and thick hair. Now, what are we talking about? Is this the difference between a successful pregnancy and not? No. Of course, this is an aggregate data overall, but there is a positive correlation between health of the hair as an overall honest indicator of overall body health, in which reproductive health is a component. All right, we talked about what men find attractive in women. How about vice versa? Well, women don't particularly want the hourglass shape in a male. There's no reason for a male to have big hips. He doesn't need to bear a child. But they do prefer a different body type. And that's the triangle body type, right? Broad shoulders, skinny waist. So it's the inverted triangle. The interesting thing about height, which you also see up here, is that, again, height is it's determined primarily by growth hormone, which is correlated strongly with a bunch of other hormones, including testosterone, where testosterone is often responsible for things like dominance and power, wealth, status. And so the preference for women to prefer taller individuals, which is pretty universal, although within a culture there's cultural variations in height, usually taller is better. If you're a woman looking for a man, actually has some honest cues behind it, right? The same way that the curvy body shape is an honest indicator of a woman's reproductive health. And then we talked about facial symmetry. So both males prefer symmetrical faces of women, and women prefer symmetrical faces of males. It's actually stronger, though, for men preferring women. So men prefer women whose faces are more symmetrical than women who prefer men's faces, although they too prefer symmetry over non-symmetry. All right, so here's a figure from your textbooks. If you've been reading along, you've already seen this. Simple, straightforward question asked to the general population. It's an American sample. Between body and brains, which do you prefer in a mate? Well, maybe not surprisingly then, what you see is that women judging men tend to prefer smarts, which conforms to the stereotype that men should be smarter. And men preferring women tend to, with the most statistical differences, prefer women's bodies over brains. Maybe messed up, right? But that's what the data says. This was done, I think, in 2004, so it's still pretty recent. So you almost have, you can ask yourself, well, is this a chicken and egg problem, right? Do we have these preferences and then women tend to play up their bodies and oftentimes minimize their intellectual abilities and men do the reverse? Or is it those differences actually exist and then are capitalized on? And I think it's a little bit of both. So usually we talk about this idea that opposites attract, at least we're talking about romantic relationships, but that's actually not true. In fact, most people prefer mates, romantic partners, that match them in qualities. It could be physical qualities, it could be intellectual qualities, it could be psychosocial qualities, it could be athletic qualities. So if you're smart, you're probably going to look for somebody who's smart. If you're dumb, you probably will look for somebody who's the same IQ, I won't say dumb. If you're really athletic though, right, you're probably going to be attracted to somebody who's good at sports. Again, not always, but there's what's called a matching phenomenon happening. The interesting thing is that when there's an unequal, there's non-matching, if you will, it's that the less than so desirable person actually conforms to some of these stereotypes that we have. What do I mean? Well, if a woman is not particularly smart, she's probably really good looking. Or if a man is not particularly good looking, he's probably really wealthy, or has high status. And you see these old dudes with these really young, beautiful women. You're like, how the hell did they get together? Right? So there's no matching happening there. But if there's there's inequity, it usually follows these gender stereotypes that we have, that women are beautiful and that men are wealthy. So they compensate for the other deficit, if you will, by being better in the stereotyped. So again, not always, but when we talk about any type of statistics or give you any facts, whether it be in this course or other, we're talking about averages overall. All right, so let's move on then to looking at what makes a relationship rewarding. Well, one theory of attraction is that we're not necessarily attracted to people, or we don't become, in this case, friends with somebody because of some deep-seated meaning, like they're a great, wonderful person, but actually because they make us feel better about ourselves. So you can think about this theory as very self-interested, egocentric. That the reason why we pick people to hang around with and to become friends with is that they actually promote us in some way. Maybe not physically, maybe they don't give us money, or they don't necessarily make us look good, but maybe they make us feel good about ourselves, right? So this is kind of a self-interested theory of attraction. So think about it as the reward theory of attraction. How do we know that this is a viable theory? Well, the data from this study tells us that this, in fact, does make some sense. So all they did in this study, it's kind of an old study already, but really gave us the basis for this theory of attraction, is they had participants come into the laboratory and judge pictures of women, both men and female, male and female participants. And here's the clever thing. Some of the pictures that were asked to be judged for how nice the person looked reminded the participants of the experimenter that they just interacted with. And in some cases, the experimenter, in half the cases, the experimenter was super friendly, really nice and bubbly, and made you feel really comfortable about being there. And in the other half, participants were assigned to a condition that was kind of random, kind of neutral, I should say. So they just interacted with the experimenter as you might imagine that you usually would. So the experimenter wasn't particularly nice. And then they put up these faces of these individual women, one in each pair that reminded them of the experimenter, and simply asked, based on the condition, your interaction with the experimenter, do you prefer, do you like more the person who looks like the experimenter if the experimenter was nice to you in the friendly condition? So let me show you the stimuli. You can laugh at these people because they're very easy, right? So here are the two stimuli. This is just a sample trial that you're asked to indicate how friendly each of these individuals are, as well as how likable you think that the two are. Here's the experimenter. So there's a clear resemblance that she looks more like this woman. I would say that. And she, the glasses, the short hair, right? Eyebrows. Yeah. You see the eyebrows? I really see that. I thought it was the eyebrows over there. No, it's just the glasses. So the question is, if the experimenter is really nice to you, do you judge her as being more friendly? And if she's neutral, well, then you probably wouldn't judge her as more friendly. You might actually pick her because, in fact, most people would agree she's better looking, right, than the other one. I don't know. Who's mad? She's got the long hair, right? So they made the prediction that participants who interact with the experimenter, who's very friendly to them, would pick the picture, given the two paired side by side, of the similar-looking woman as being more friendly, as well as more likable. And what you see then here plotted on the y-axis is the number of people picking the picture that looks like the experimenter based on condition. So here's about how many people pick the short-haired girl who haven't had a necessarily positive, not a negative, but not essentially a positive interaction with the experimenter. So about 1/4, which says that there's a bias, right, towards the girl with long hair. But here's the interesting thing about hypothesis. If you just interacted with the experimenter in a very positive way, that is, she was friendly, you're statistically more likely then to pick the short-haired girl who looks like the experimenter as being the friendlier one. So that's the short-haired one. This is what's plotted is the short-haired one. So more people pick the short-haired girl as being friendly encounter with the experimenter than the neutral encounter with the experimenter. And it's a little bit of a weird way to plot the data. So what you're seeing plotted is how many people pick the short-haired girl based on the condition they were assigned to. So yeah, it does work. So it says that at least the reward attraction of theory is viable. Of course, we're attracted to people for all of the reasons we've talked about. Proximity, familiarity, reminding us of ourselves, matching phenomenon. But yeah, people that make us feel good, we're attracted to. All right, so more questions in this lecture. Different types of love. So if you think about all of the different types of love for family member, love for romantic partner, love for a child, they all have a couple common elements to them. These are the 3 common elements that have been defined, supposedly transcend all types of love. Understanding, that's important. Giving and receiving, especially emotional support. And then just enjoying being around that person. Now I'm going to actually question that one, because we all have family that we do not enjoy being around, right? We still love them. I'm not sure how I feel about that point, but that's what your textbook says, so we're going to go with it. We'll throw that in there. So Sternberg is probably the most famous relationship psychologist, and he gives us different types of love. 4 types of love, and these 4 types of love are based on 3 dimensions. I'll define each of the 4 types, and then I'll show you how the dimensions lead to these 4 types. Most of them are pretty self-explanatory. Romantic love, that would be love for somebody you're romantically or sexually attracted to. It also says there's companion love. That's love for maybe a really good friend, your companion. Obviously, it's no sexual interaction, but you still have a profound liking for them, commitment to them. That would work. Fatuous love. This is the idea of being infatuated with somebody. The idea that you can totally be committed and love somebody and they have no idea that you exist. So there's kind of a one-sided interaction. And then Sternberg says kind of the end-all be-all is the consummate love. And that's all kinds of love, everything you could want, high on all 3 dimensions that we'll look at next. You can think about it as all-consuming, hence consummate. So I'm going to jump ahead 1 slide and come back. So here are the 3 dimensions then that Sternberg gives us. You can see how each is defined by a combination of the dimensions. The first dimension is how much you like the person, and liking is described as intimacy, where intimacy could be physical, but doesn't have to be. He also has commitment as a factor, and then passion, which doesn't have to be sexual passion, as a factor. So romantic love, then he says, is defined by high intimacy, high liking, and high passion. Okay, makes sense. Companionate love would be high intimacy, so high liking, and high commitment. You want to be with that person, they're your best friend, because they've been your best friend forever, and it's high commitment, and high liking. Fatuous love, interestingly, high passion, right? You're enthralled with somebody. High commitment, you're committed to them, at least maybe psychologically, but notice that there's no liking, there's no intimacy. They probably don't even know that you exist. And then consummate love would be high on all 3 factors. High liking, high passion, high commitment. One other interesting thing I find about this triangle is that you have this peak at the bottom corner, if you will, and it's called empty love. And this is what I like to describe marriages that are committed to staying, people that are committed to staying married, but they don't love each other anymore. So all they have is high commitment. In fact, liking is probably, right, passion is probably, but they're still committed to being in a relationship. And it's sad. Somebody in my other class too, a girl from China, she raised her hand, she's like, some of the arranged marriages. Yeah, that's a perfect example, right? You don't know who she was, but that's. And some of those stay together just so their kids all out. Yeah. Yeah. Is that the same thing, right? Yeah, same thing. You're committed for whatever reason, but there's nothing else really going on. All right, so that's one way to kind of carve up the pie of love, if you will. The other way is a more dimensional approach, which is just to make a distinction between passion and companion. So passionate love, actually the main factor, the main thing that determines the difference between these 2 is how much arousal you have. And I don't just mean sexual arousal. Remember, arousal is a general term. So passionate love then is dominated by high arousal. It could be high arousal because it's sexual, like you've just started dating someone and you're have the super hots for he or she. But it also could be passionate love that a mother has for her child. Obviously, it's not sexual, but it's just being completely wrapped up and enthralled. So it's that intense fascination. Whereas companion love is defined by low arousal. Still good, still stable, still enjoy being around with the person. So maybe you're married for 45 years. It's not really all that passionate anymore, but maybe really still love each other. That's the companion love. So low arousal, it's actually it's a very rewarding love, or can be a very rewarding love. Even though it's not high arousing, it's oftentimes more stable. So most romantic relationships start here, and they kind of become this, right, with time. In fact, I have a really interesting quote from an African woman from a tribe called the Kung, who describes this in her own language and translated into English, and she actually captures these two dimensions really well. Here's what she says. When two people are first together, their hearts are on fire and their passion is great. But then the fire cools, and that's how it stays. They continue to love each other, but it's a different way. It's warm and dependable. Well, here's somebody who's not exposed to Western culture, as far as we know, who still says, these are the two types of love. And I think there's a lot of truth to that too. I think we can easily resonate with these dimensions. Okay, so let's move on then to the last question, which is to look at attachment, equity, and disclosure as things that promote love. How many of you remember, either from 101 or Lifespan Development, Ainsworth's attachment styles? Remember that? Okay. Well, I'm going to remind you of them if you don't remember. So Ainsworth, famous social psychologist, who came up with a way to assess how bonded, if you will, how attached a child is to his or her primary caregiver. Usually it's the mother, but doesn't have to be. She came up with this situation, an experimental situation called a strange situation. And here's how the strange situation works, and based on the child's behavior, a child is determined to be in one of these four categories. So in this experiment, what happens is that children and their primary caregiver come into the laboratory. It's a new, strange situation, hence the name. They play together, they interact with the new toys, and then the primary caregiver leaves the room, is asked to leave the room as part of the experiment. And you measure, as the experimenter, what the infant or child does. You also then measure what the infant or child does when the caregiver comes back at a set period of time later, usually it's like 5 or 6 minutes. And based on the child's or infant's reaction initially to when the caregiver leaves and then when he or she comes back, you can determine whether a child is securely attached or insecurely attached. And those that are insecurely attached have 3 different types of attachment styles. Those that are avoidant, those that are resistant, and those that are disorganized. So let me tell you about each of these 4, and then I'll show you a short video. So what does it mean to be secure? Well, this is the most desirable attachment style, at least in Western cultures. So this is when a child notably becomes distressed when the primary caregiver leaves. Most children get a little distressed when mom or dad leaves. But the most important and telltale sign is that within a couple of minutes of the primary caregiver leaving, they're able to go back and interact, play with the toys, and they're pretty much okay. The other telltale sign is that when the caregiver comes back, they seem genuinely happy to see the caregiver. They engage with the caregiver, they may smile, they may run over to the caregiver, they may reference the caregiver. Pretty much says they really like these people, hence they're securely bonded. Avoidant children, what they do is when the caregiver leaves, they essentially don't cry at all. They don't notice when the caregiver leaves, and they don't notice really when the caregiver comes back. They're just avoidant. Sometimes they're called ambivalent. It's pretty much like, you're never there for me, so why am I going to get upset, or why am I going to greet you when you come back? I don't care kind of attitude, right? Insecure resistant children are completely opposite. These are the over-clingy children. These are the children who cry excessively when mom or dad leaves and then can't get it back together in that period of time where they're left just with the experimenter. They're over-clingy. They literally be the ones that are hanging on mom and dad's leg. And then when the caregiver comes back, they're usually still crying. They're still distressed. It's like they have very little coping skills, or their coping skill manifests itself in crying. Although these are kind of negative attachment styles, they're still called normal scope of development. This is the one that's probably the most problematic, or the one that's least desirable, if you will. And these are children who are disorganized, and what makes them disorganized is that they actually flip-flop and show signs of both being avoidant and resistant. So what this looks like is somebody who's very passive-aggressive, or a child who's very, very passive-aggressive. So they might get really angry when the caregiver leaves, and then not care when they come back. Or maybe they don't care when the They don't care when the caregiver leaves, but then when he or she comes back, they get really angry. So they're kind of flip-flopping between, I don't know if I like you, I do like you, I'm mad at you, and they don't really know. Because basically their environment has been really unstable and unpredictable up to this point. So let me show you a quick little video that highlights these different attachment types and shows you what this strange situation, how it looks in the laboratory. We won't watch the whole thing, but I'll give you a few minutes of it.
From the enormous pool of data that Ainsworth and her students had collected in natural situations, they discovered much about the changes in babies' attachment behaviors across the first year of life, and about the relationships between infant and maternal behavior. For example, contrary to the opinions of most experts since the 1880s, Ainsworth found that babies whose mothers had responded to their cries quickly and sensitively when they were in their first 6 months of life cried much less than when they were. They were also more compliant or obedient later in the first year, cooperating with necessary transitions. They also explored more and developed new cognitive skills sooner than babies whose mothers had been less sensitive to their early needs and signals. Mothers who allowed the baby to set the timing and the pace of feedings tended to have less difficult and more secure children by the end of the first year. Ainsworth thought the sensitivity of the primary caregiver in terms of picking up cues from a baby and responding to them appropriately is probably a key factor in establishing secure attachments in infancy. Later studies have found that the infant's temperaments, whether they were edgy or placid, quiet or active, were not at all as important in predicting individual differences in the baby's attachments. Sensitive caregivers seem to adjust themselves to the individual characteristics of their babies. Ainsworth concluded from her Uganda and Baltimore studies that this sensitive caregiver led a baby to treat his attachment figure as a haven of safety when things seem unsafe or overwhelming. For example, notice how the baby immediately reaches for his mother as I approach him too closely. The baby also uses his mother as a secure base, or base camp, from which to move off and explore and develop new confidence when he is soothed and or feeling comfortable. This is a two-part function of the caregiver for the child, that she serves as a haven of safety and as a secure base, is a basic premise of attachment theory. In order to validate her own observations, Ainsworth developed a standardized laboratory procedure that has become an important tool in the study of children between the ages of about 10 months and 5 or 6 years. It is called a strange situation because, in fact, it's just that for the baby or young child. The child and the caregiver enter a room that has lots of toys and some chairs. The caregiver puts the child on the floor to explore.
Is it a shape sorter? Shape?
After about 3
Nice to meet you.
Sit down, briefly chat with the caregiver,
It's fine.
and then begins to play with the child.
It's a gorgeous day. I like your comments. I do.
The caregiver then leaves, and the stranger interacts with the baby.
So she's obviously securely attached, right? Now let's see how she treats mom and mom she's dragging. The caregiver signals for return. Reunites with the baby and interacts with the baby while the stranger leaves. We're going to speed up to some of the other attachment styles, because it goes on for a little while. How old is that baby? I think she's, no, say maybe 12 months, 10, 12 months. Yeah, she doesn't look too old, but she does, looks like she has some teeth. All right, so let's see right there.
She also found babies securely attached to their mothers, like the one you just saw, tended to go to their mothers to be picked up. They were quickly soothed and then returned to happy exploration. Ainsworth found that 66% of the Baltimore pairs had these secure attachments. She also found two categories of anxious or insecure attachments, which we here illustrate in animations of actual lab footage to protect privacy. Some babies were less obviously upset by the separation, and their reunion were slow to initiate contact with their caregivers. In Ainsworth's study, 21% of the pairs were in this avoid category of attachment. Another category of babies, labeled as having insecure and ambivalent resistant attachments, did less initial exploration and were obviously highly stressed by the separation. It was very difficult for their mothers to calm them on their own, and the babies tended to show frequent behaviors such as kicking and arching their backs. These made up 13% of the original sample. Several years later, after studying mainstream situations, Judy Solomon and Mary Main, a former student of Ainsworth's, identified a fourth category called disorganized. These babies were utterly overwhelmed by the experience. Some seemed momentarily terrified by their parents' reentry. Others approached and then retreated with a dazed expression, unable to make an organized response to their distress. Further research by Main and others has shown that most children with this disorganized pattern have been raised in families who have suffered some significant loss, trauma, or maltreatment. For all these patients, whatever category, the strange situation triggered attachment behaviors they had developed in their first months of life. The patterns have proven to be quite stable over time and to color future interpersonal relationships.
All right, so let's stop it there. A couple more things, though, that I do want to mention. Okay, so one of the things that was brought up in the video is that these are pretty stable. So if you test a child at 6 or 7 months, and you test them again in 2 or 3 years, pretty much what they were in terms of attachment styles is what they are then later on. The other thing that the video goes on to highlight, but I'm not going to play because it goes on for another 10 minutes or so, is that although these have a lot of predictive power, and I'll show you why and how in the next slide, it's not deterministic of future relationships. So what I mean by that is that whatever attachment style you have gives you a strong likelihood of becoming this way as an adult, but a positive experience later on can compensate for a negative upbringing, and vice versa. A negative situation, even for a securely attached baby later on in life, can make you maybe engage in less secure, less healthy relationships. But here's what we do know. So secure infants are generally the ones that go on to have more friends and also to have better, more satisfying relationships, including romantic relationships as adults. So in knowing what a secure attachment looks like as a child, then I think it makes sense to say these are children who are really kind of easygoing. They get upset or distressed when mom or dad leaves, which is normal. You should feel a little bit bad when somebody who cares for you leaves. But then they go on and they're allowed to essentially continue with their lives. And so as adults, they tend to be pretty easygoing. They're not excessively worried about being abandoned, or they don't become too needy or too dependent. Infants who are insecurely avoidant tend to invest less time in adult relationships. They also are more likely to leave them. So remember, these are the children that basically just don't care if the caregiver's around. So I was saying that as an adult, I don't really care about their adult relationships. They can give or take. They can have them, they can not have them. It's not a big deal. In fact, these individuals are more likely to engage in one-night stands. They don't get particularly close to anybody because, again, they didn't have that relationship with mom or dad growing up. They're pretty much left to fend for themselves. Resistant infants, remember, those are the ones that were excessively clingy. They couldn't regulate, they couldn't control themselves. They cried, they kept crying, they couldn't be soothed. Well, not surprisingly, as adults, these infants, as adults, tend to be less trusting. They also tend to be more possessive and more jealous. In fact, they're more likely to break up with somebody, get back together, break up with them, that whole cycle, that jealousy, possession, back and forth. And they're also the adults who tend to get more angry in relationships, just more emotional overall. And again, I think it makes sense if you go back and you think about how clingy these children were as infants. They were always trying to get the caregiver's attention. Well, as adults, they're pretty much doing the same thing, right? They're very concerned about what the other person is doing and having all of their attention. So we don't have a lot of data for the last category because it's a relatively newer category, but from what we do know, although I didn't write it here, is that this the children then who as adults go on to have probably the worst relationships, if you will, tend to be ones who are more likely to engage in or get involved in an abusive relationship. Okay, so that was attachment, that was one factor. So quickly we'll look at equity and disclosure, and we'll take a short break, and then we'll finish with helping. So equity is the sense of being equal in a relationship. So all of us have kind of know when relationships start to deteriorate, usually they start to deteriorate because you feel like you're doing all the work. And that could be because you're making all the arrangements, you're doing all of the upkeep in the relationship, you're the one who's always initiating the phone calls, whatever it is. So the interesting thing is that although most of us don't actually calculate in any cognitive way how much somebody's giving to a relationship, we have a very strong sense of when it's not equal. So we say it's not really calculated in a relationship. I'm not recording how many minutes my husband, holds in my hand versus I hold his, or how many times he puts away the dishes versus I do. It's not calculated, but I certainly know when I feel like I'm doing way more than he is. In fact, long-term inequity is the number one thing that causes marital distress. One person feels like they're doing all the work. The interesting thing is that if a relationship's already stressed, so there's already marital distress, that's not due to inequity, it makes you more likely to see inequity in your partner's behaviors. It's that selective exposure, that confirmation bias we've talked about. So you're already upset with your husband, well now it's really easy to see the fact that he forgot to put the dishes away again, right? So it kind of makes this cycle in, if you will. That's all we're going to say about equity. Say a couple things about disclosure. Equity is important, sense of being equal. The other big thing that's important is being able to reveal aspects of your life. That's called self-disclosure. Typically we think about it as revealing something that's important about yourself, intimate aspects of your life. Good relationships are built on trust. Trust is built on self-disclosure. The interesting thing about self-disclosure is that it doesn't actually have to be high self-disclosure. It just has to be equal among the two. So if nobody's an oversharer, you're not an oversharer and your husband's not an oversharer, it's still equal. The problem is when you have somebody who overshares and the other person doesn't share back. Then it's unequal, and then you don't have good self-disclosure, reciprocity between one another. Why does this work? Well, when you engage in revealing aspects about yourself that are sensitive or intimate, it allows you just to reduce all that social comparison that we normally do so readily. So remember, one of the best ways that we know ourselves, going way back to the beginning of the class, is by comparing ourselves to others. So once you stop doing that, you actually become much more comfortable, and it just reduces your inhibitions. You don't have to worry about who you should be, you can just be who you are, if you will. Well, here's one study that shows us that, in fact, disclosure is fundamental for increasing love. All they did in this study was bring people into the laboratory and randomly pair a male and a female together and ask them to do one of two things for 10 minutes, I think it was. Engage in small talk, so they were given a script about things that they should talk about, and they had to only talk about those things. The weather, what classes they're in, what baseball team you like, just chit-chat. Or they were assigned to a group in which the script was ask them very pointed questions that were sensitive in nature. So maybe, what was your first romantic relationship like? How do you feel about your mom and your dad? Have you ever been abused? Things that would obviously be high on the intimacy scale to mimic high self-disclosure. You're paired with somebody in one of those two conditions for 10 minutes. You either engage in small talk if you're in that condition, or self-disclosure if you're in that condition. And then after 10 minutes, you're given a survey about how close you feel to that person that you've talked with for 10 minutes. And they made the prediction, not surprisingly, that participants who engaged in the high self-disclosure would feel closer than those who engaged in small talk. Pretty straightforward. And yes, that's in fact what you see. So this is how close you feel to the person after your 10 minutes or so of chit chat or small talk or disclosure. And those that reveal intimate aspects of themselves, those in the high disclosure group reported being more close, statistically so, to the new person. Remember, as a stranger before that interaction transpired than those who engaged in small talk. But here's the really interesting thing about this study. They then went on to ask these people if they were in a current relationship, and if so, how long, and how close they felt to their current partner. And overwhelmingly, the majority of people said they now felt closer to the stranger that they had just engaged with for 10 minutes than their current romantic partner. So in some cases, it was a husband or a wife. In some cases, it was a new relationship, but in many cases, it was a very long-standing relationship. And so they're saying, I feel now closer to someone after 10 minutes than somebody I've spent the rest of my life with. And I think what's happening then, it shows us the power of just simply communicating about important things. And that really does promote love. It promotes attraction to one another. Okay, any questions about that study? All right, so that's the end of attraction. Those are the references again for the studies, if anybody wants more details. And why don't we take a 3-minute break, come back at 1:45, and then we should be able to do helping in the last 45 minutes.
I have to look at myself.
Okay. Well, good luck to you. I won't see you after this, but don't be a stranger.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Oh, yeah, teach one. Thank you. You're welcome. Take care.
Thank you.
I couldn't match more to me. Oh my gosh. That's really, oh my god. That's really so. It's so my gosh. Yeah. You didn't know what's going on. Everybody in my work knows what it is. So sometimes if they're too crazy, when there's some one all of them. Nobody knows. It's crazy. You know, like, what? Oh, to rain, to rain? No. No. Okay, today that's time. Then we have like language. Oh, you are. I see how this is like. Yeah. Yes. No. No, you see
So to start off this lecture, have your last in-class activity. It is just a simple survey on helping. I think we've gone over 10, so this can replace an activity if you missed one or if you use extra credit.
Yeah, I have one class. And I have two, I don't have two on it, okay?
Me too, and I'm gonna take 4.
And it's two classes.
I don't.
This is crap.
You're sure you're not just looking at the extra credit?
My 15 10, I work from my 11.
Okay, so one thing about the ones that are actually blank might not actually be the ones you missed, because we went over 10, when the TA put the numbers in, he went back and just filled in if you had an 11, anywhere you had a blank. So just because you have a blank in a certain number, doesn't mean that it's actually that you missed. Because what it is just kind of find points you have at the end of the semester, so it doesn't really matter where you get the points from, so they're in there somewhere. So right now you have 4 that are missing.
Yeah, but I don't trust one class. Yeah, I'm not.
I'm not sure why there needs to be there. The most ever had this too. One thing you can do is, my office hours, you can go through them and see if you can find them. And I'm pretty good about, do logs by hand, and they can list them, but I'm pretty good about trying to be accurate.
Yeah, I know exactly.
Okay.
Usually when it's like not big things yet, they're all exclamation points. So I answer the situation.
Are you around campus tomorrow? Can you come by the office? Okay. The office hours 12:30 to 2. You should pop in, I'll give you the stack and if you can find them.
I can't.
Okay. Can you email me and I'll be
Thank you.
Everybody else?
Shouldn't be too long, simple yes, no, or maybe answer.
But where is it?
I think the blood is only 750.
Well, these are a little old. I don't know if it's gone up or not. I mean, this is like 10 years old. Maybe it's $8 now. I don't know. All right, so how many of you are convinced that any of these, or more than one, are in fact altruism? So how many people checked yes for at least one of them? All right, so what did you check yes for? Brian, which ones did you check yes for?
Number one, number two, and 5.
Okay. So if 1, 2, and 5, does anyone want to disagree why they might not be altruism, based on what you think you know?
I didn't think one was because he's doing it out of that.
So do you think that maybe it's self-interested somehow?
Would you say self-interest?
Self-interested?
Maybe he's doing it for himself.
Yeah, so maybe he's doing it, we don't know anything about his motivation, right? But one thing we might want to question is, well, how does this make him feel? Not the boy, but Bob. And if you could argue that if it makes Bob feel good, that's not really altruism, right? Because altruism, by definition, means that you're not getting any rewards for it. You're just doing it at actually an expense to yourself. But if it makes Bob feel good about his life and helping somebody else, then I don't know that's really altruism. It's one of the things that we'll look at when we look at the definition. What about number 2? You thought it was altruism? Anyone say no? Well, what if Mary is an attorney for victims who have just been in an auto accident? Maybe she's trying to get some business, right? You don't know.
I was thinking like dangerously for him driving and stuff.
Maybe not right now she's going to ask this person to hire as a lawyer, but maybe in 5 months, if the person gets out of the hospital, say, hey, remember when I saved you on the side? By the way, I'm a personal injury lawyer. Guess the point is we don't know again, right? So there could be long-term rewards. There could be rewards that we don't know about that could be self-interested. There could be rewards that come in the future. But if there's any kind of rewards, then you can technically argue that it's self-interested. How about any of the other ones? Anyone else say, yeah, definitely altruism? Yeah.
Well, the number 4 though, John, the firefighter, I feel like he doesn't know he's just confused.
That's true. But is it altruistic, regardless of the reward, is it altruistic if he rescues somebody and that's his job?
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
I would say, okay.
It's not you, it's chick.
I was gonna say, if that's his job, does that really make it altruistic if he gets paid to be a firefighter? And part of his job is rescuing people?
Well, I
Just playing devil's advocate.
just feel like what you said, if they get a reward, it's like not necessary.
Well, that's true, but even if he doesn't know the reward is coming, right? I think you could eliminate that from the statement, and then you'd say, well, is it altruistic if he rescues somebody? Because the altruism is not really about the reward, it's about the action. If he rescues somebody from a fire when he is a firefighter, then I feel like, well, you're just getting paid for your job, right? I mean, maybe he went out and put himself in harm's way, but again, he's getting a reward in the sense that he's getting a paycheck to do that. What about any of the other ones? 5? And why do you think that that's altruism? What made you say, yeah, it's definitely altruism? Okay, so no one can track her down, but maybe it makes Millie feel good about herself. If it makes Millie feel good about herself, well, then it's not really altruistic, is it? So I think you can see where we're going with this. So let's talk about some of the internal rewards, and then we'll talk about altruism and some other strategies or theories of helping. So the first theory we're going to talk about is social norms theory. This is the idea that we tend to help those who our society or our culture suggests needs to be helped. It's not really, it's not like you consider if they're going to help you back, but it's a societal pressure to help the poor, to help the elderly, to help the disenfranchised. So it's a social need. It typically happens under certain circumstances. We feel more pressure when we feel similar to the victim, or at least we've been told or emphasized that similarity has been emphasized in some way. Remember back to the bystander effect when we talked about conformity, where we saw the video of that guy who was lying on the streets of London, and he was either dressed as the businessman or dressed as kind of a bum. And people actually went out of their way to help him when he reminded them of themselves. That was that in-group identification, that perceived similarity. So social norms theory says that not only do we help those who society says need help, but also those who remind us of ourselves in a certain way. And if people remind us of ourselves, then you have to argue that's not really altruistic, because we all know that we're self-serving. One of the things that we all engage in is the self-serving bias. So then we're helping people probably with the expectation that that person's like us and might actually help us in the future. So this leads us to something called the reciprocity norm. You can think about it as social capital or social exchange. So it's the expectation that people will help those who have helped them. So the whole pay it forward, right? Do it now and then. So I help somebody now, somebody will help me later on. It might not necessarily be the same person, but there's the society base. And so maybe if you think about it as an amorphous bank of helping, contribute to that bank of helping, something or someone from that bank of helping is going to pass it back to me at some point. So it's maybe not tit for tat, but it's still, I help now, I'll get help in return. I pay into taxes because later on I'm going to get a program that benefits me, that tax supported.
Is that why people say there's no free lunch?
Yes. Yeah, that's exactly why. Thinking about it, what goes around comes around. The whole idea of social capital, that really it's kind of like a currency, right? We pay in ways with our helping behavior. And so if you pay a lot in your helping behavior, probably someone's going to pay almost equivalent back at some point. If you don't help a lot, you're probably not going to be the recipient of a lot of help. So that's one theory. That's the theory of social norms. Theory of social exchange is a more psychological-based theory. The first one is probably more of a cognitive theory, if you will. Social exchange theory says that we help those who maximize our rewards and minimize our costs. What do I mean by that? That we actually calculate how much I have to put out for how much am I going to get back. So how many minutes do I have to help somebody? Is this worth my while? How many dollars do I actually have to donate before it becomes detrimental to me? So if I give $5 and I make $1 million, well, it's not really much of a detriment. But if I make $10 and I give half of it away, that's a calculated detriment, right? So this social exchange theory says that we tend to help, but if we help in ways that aren't so calculated or aren't so detrimental to us, that we still can be at the receiving end of the benefit. So you can almost think of, you do something to make yourself look good, but you know that it's, again, going to come back and you're going to benefit from it because it didn't give you so much of a cost initially. Like you give the $5, but that really didn't make a difference for you. But it made everyone think that you're, this big spender. You give to charity. But the reality is that $5 didn't really make a difference for you. You would have just, not really missed it either way. So similar to the first theory, but a little bit different, a little bit more psychologically based, if you will. The other one's a little bit more socially based. So then we can ask ourselves, well, we talked about society, how does this work? Well, the third theory then is the social responsibility. A little bit about it in social norms theory, but the social responsibility theory says that we have certain expectations that are placed upon us to help specific people. The poor, the disenfranchised, women, minorities. In fact, if you look at who helps whom, men tend to help females more often than they help other males because there's, again, that stereotyped idea that women should be weak and feeble and need more help. And women, interestingly, are much more egalitarian in how much help they dole out. So they actually help males and females at about the same rates. But social responsibility says that there's an expectation, societal expectation, that certain people or certain groups of people should be helped more. The needy, the poor. Okay, so let's talk more then about altruism. So you've already probably started to second guess if you said yes on your survey whether or not it's actually altruism. Altruism would require that you are acting selfishly. Another way to say that is that you increase somebody else's welfare. You do something nice for somebody without actually being self-interested. And usually, as part of this definition, although not always, is that you actually incur some cost to yourself. So not just that it doesn't affect you negatively, but that you actually put yourself in a position of, you put yourself in a worse position to help somebody else. So maybe you could think about it in the case of you jump into a freezing lake to save a stranger who's just fallen through the ice. So there's a negative cost. You might actually kill yourself or hurt yourself with the increased help towards somebody else. You might say that's a pure act of altruism. But I might argue with you because if you could say, well, we did that and as a result, at some level, even if it wasn't a cognitive level, knew I was going to get a reward or get publicity from it, or it simply just made me feel good, then it's not really altruistic. So I think you'd be hard-pressed to find any act that you might initially consider altruistic to be altruistic, because if it motivates you to feel good about yourself, or you expect that even at some future date somebody's going to help you, or that society is going to come back and help you, even if it's not the individual that you just helped, then it's not really altruism. But it as helping really just makes you feel better about yourself. not going to say that altruism never exists, but I think it's really, really hard to find. So here's the figure from your book about how this works. So you sense somebody else is in trouble, distress. Here's one route that you can go. You can become stressed yourself, upset, anxious, disturbed. That can motivate you to reduce your own stress. The behavior might then be to achieve reduction of your own stress. So that would be self-interested. Alternatively, if you were looking for true altruism, you might see someone else's distress, and that actually elicits something like empathy in you, which motivates you then not to reduce your own stress, that mimicry, but that actually makes you help for the reasons that we assume are based on helping non-selfishly. So I think you have to ask yourself then, what is the internal motivation to really start to get at what is self-interested behavior versus what's altruistic? And if something makes you upset and you do the action, the helping, as a way to reduce your own distress, that's self-interested. So what I want to look quickly at is something called the prisoner's dilemma. Has anyone ever heard of this? We're not going to do it as an in-class exercise because I want to get you out of here in the next 20 minutes or so. But the prisoner's dilemma is a hypothetical game, and it's usually set up as two people who have committed a crime, and you've committed the crime together. And the question is, if you both committed the crime together and are captured, but you're interviewed separately, what are you going to do? Are you going to admit to the crime and implicate the other person as well? Or should you keep your mouth silent and not say anything? So it's set up as a game of strategy between cooperation and defecting or defects. So you can imagine that you both get captured, you committed a crime together, so you robbed a bank. You both get captured and you get pulled apart separately. And the person interviewing you says, okay, I'll cut you a deal. You know what? If you're not implicated, you're going to go free. But he's making the same deal to the other guy too. But you don't know what the other guy is going to say. So what's the best strategy given these four outcomes to engage in? So let's say you're prisoner A, you can stay silent, that would be to cooperate, prisoner B. Or you can betray prisoner B, which is the same as defecting. So if you stay silent and you cooperate, each of you are going to get 1 year in prison. If you defect, don't implicate the other guy, you're going to go free and give the other guy 3 years. But remember, the other guy has the same deal. So he can do the same deal. In which case, you get 3 years, he goes free if he defects. Or, you both could defect, and you each get 2 years. So what would you do? Think about it for a second. What's the best strategy?
Stay silent.
Why would you stay silent?
Because after we get out, and that's what we do. We stay silent, and we're both just going to get a deal.
Okay. So if you stay silent and he stays silent, you both get a year. But what if you stay silent and he defects? Then what do you get?
I'll get 3 years.
If you stay silent and he defects,
Yeah, I'll get 3 years.
you'll get 3 years.
I'll see him again.
That's actually really interesting because if you know that you'll see this person again, you'll behave very differently. Let's assume you're not going to see this person again. So this says, okay, stay silent. Anyone say no, you should defect. You don't know what the other guy's going to do.
I would defect.
Why would you defect?
Because if the other prisoner stays silent, I go free. And if he defects, I get 2 years. But if I stay silent and they decide we both get a year, or I get 3 years.
So what's the average of that?
It will be about the same average, but I like the option to go for it.
So you get either 1 year, you either get 0 or 3, or you get 1 or 2. That's what it comes down to. I'm looking at my phone because I've got notes here. Sometimes I find that it's easier to look at my notes than try to explain this. So remember, cooperation means you're agreeing with one another. Defect means that the prosecutors offer you to basically rat out the other guy. So how many say defect? Let's take a vote.
And if you never see the person.
If you never, assuming you never see the person again.
She.
You say defect? Let's take a vote. Okay. How many people say defect? Raise your hand. Okay. Everyone else says cooperate? All right. So here's how it goes. It's best to defect if you know that he's not going to do the same, right? But because you don't know that, the best strategy is to cooperate, because you can't be sure what the other person is going to do. Which means that you either get 1 year or you get
So you get 3.
you get 3.
I just think, even if you don't read, it's like, either way, that chance of getting that is like, I feel like it outweighs no matter what. There's 3 chances of going versus the 1 chance of getting out. So
That's
I would
interesting.
stay quiet, because either way, I'm most likely going to go in the anyways.
That is true. That is true. That's true. Well, and that's interesting because people actually, there's a path of reasoning in which people try to minimize their losses. So the fact here that it looks like there's only 1 instance to go free makes that actually more appealing, which may be why people tended to say defect instead of cooperate. But it all is based on knowing what the other person is going to do. And if you don't know, then the best strategy is to cooperate. So why did I talk about that here?
We're going to do a game probably. You get the asking loan.
It's one of the things that is technically considered true altruism.
Which one do you think it would be?
To be quiet.
What if you were to be quiet?
I feel like either way, it's not altruism. It's all about people.
Yeah, I feel like the only option that would be altruistic would be sort of like not cooperating, but defecting and implicating yourself.
That's right. That's right. Did you guys all hear her?
So, when we said 2 years, that would be altruistic.
Well, if you basically implicated yourself and you said that the other place would, so how would that read out?
Oh, if you say I did it and you did it.
Yeah, right. I'm trying to think how it would play out here. So you,
It's the opposite of the option.
opposite of the bottom left.
So if you implicate yourself,
Right.
you get free and they go free.
That's right.
If you implicate yourself in corporate,
If you implicate yourself, but say that the other guy wasn't involved, that would be pure altruistic, right? Because then you're going to go to jail for 3 years.
even not the students should buy
All right. All right, let's move on then. Let's talk a little bit about pin selection. And then we just have a couple more things to finish up. So pin selection, another theory then of why we help, is an evolutionary theory. So we talked about social norms, we talked about social reciprocity. Here's evolutionary theory. Evolutionary theory says we help those who are going to help us essentially procreate. Maybe not directly, but indirectly. Kin selection would be helping those who are genetically related to us. think about who you give the most help to, in fact, it's usually people who are genetically related to us. Your family members. Of course, we help people who aren't related to us, but you could make then the argument that you're helping people who are already in your in-group. If you're helping somebody in your in-group, they're going to be more likely to help you in return, which could benefit you. So maybe you give your friend $10, and then later your friend gives you $10 back, and that allows you then to go on and use that $10 to pay for food for your family, which indirectly then benefits you and benefits your progeny, your likelihood that your genes are represented in the population. Both of these are more biologically based. What?
I'm sorry, it's really uncomfortable actually, because I want to sit back.
I know.
It's so much noise.
I yelled at someone the other day in one of my classes because I thought they were on their phone, and then finally somebody was like, "It's the table." I was like, "I'm sorry," because I kept hearing this like ticking, and I was like, "Turn your phone off." They're like, "It's the table," and I felt really bad. So I understand. All right, so the point is both of these strategies are really much more biologically based. So you're more likely to help somebody who either shares your genes or at least can come to your aid, which will ultimately allow you to engage in bearing your children successfully or raising the children that you already have. You can think about it as, I'll scratch your back, you'll scratch mine, or more indirectly for group selection as, I'll scratch your back and maybe you won't scratch mine, but you'll scratch so-and-so's, and so-and-so will eventually, scratch somebody who'll scratch mine. That would be the indirect or group selection way. So social norms, social reciprocity, evolutionary theory, three kind of different theories about why we help. Finally, then, let's look at when we're more likely to help. Just like there are a set of factors that predict when we're more likely to conform, as well as to be attracted to someone, there's factors that predict helping. Well, when we're high on the social pressure scale, that means we have that high arousal, that evaluation apprehension, we feel like we're being evaluated, we note it to ourselves. That usually comes in the form of social pressure. We're more likely to help. Because essentially what you do is going to be noticed. If you don't do anything, people are going to look at you as being bad or the bad seed in some way. So you may be pressured into helping. We're also more likely to help when you feel personally connected to the victim. The whole identifying or bonding with the person, that in-group effect, that bystander effect that we talked about. Right? If you can connect to the victim or the person who needs help, you're more likely to help them. Related to that is this perceived similarity. Again, if you categorize someone as being part of your in-group, again, even if you don't do it with awareness, but your brain is always implicitly categorizing people. So if somebody is placed in your in-group, you're more likely connected to them. Again, you'll be more likely to help, given that most of us tend to help ourselves. The other interesting thing is that when you're not pressed for time or under cognitive constraint, same way that allows us to engage in that slower route of thinking that we've talked about, remember fast and slow routes of thinking, where the slow route, the one that requires more energy, more time, more resources, allows you to evaluate the situation more, it actually allows you to engage in more helping behavior. If you think about it, helping requires that you do something for the most part. And it requires that you have not only good judgment, but that you have the time and the physical resources. So you don't feel stressed out or distracted, you're more likely to help. And then finally, let's talk about how we can promote more helpful behavior. We can be more altruistic. Well, one way we can increase helping is by using some of these properties that we know increase helping, so we can capitalize on them. So you can make a victim feel more related to the person you're trying to elicit help from. That's increasing responsibility. So if you personalize the bystander, doing such simple things as using a person's name, looking at them in the eyes, giving them a personal, directed, explicit request for help, all of those things make people more helpful because it increases their personal responsibility. And then more people are less likely to pass the buck, wait for somebody else to do it because now they've been directed to do it. In fact, one of the most effective things if somebody's ever suffering a heart attack or there's some medical or any kind of emergency is for someone to say, you call 911, and they teach you that in like Red Cross or whatever, is to directly ask somebody to do it, because the problem is if you don't, everybody assumes that someone else has pulled out their phone and done it. So by actually putting the pressure on someone directly by using their name, looking at them, makes them be the one to do it, and it gets done, right? Another way we can increase helping is by motivating our self-image. Talked about foot in the door phenomenon, door in the face phenomenon. It's a bit similar. How this works is that if you can get somebody, you just expose them. So you ask somebody for a favor, they turn you down. What you do is purposely up the ante, so you might ask them for something big, and then you bring down your request, and people then feel more obliged to do it. This is why markups and price often work, right? They mark up the price so that they can reduce it later, because they feel like you're getting a big sale. So company asks you for $100, and they say, well, you might not be able to give $100 charity. Well, could you just give $5? And because they've proceeded with a really big request, the $5 seems more manageable. And as a result, then you're more likely to help and to give that $5 than if they just said, can you give $5 in the first place? And then finally, what we can do is try to increase altruism through our society by teaching more moral behavior. Just like we saw, I think we saw it in this, I can't remember if we saw it in this class or not. We saw the public service announcement about modeling violence and aggression. Did I show you that in this class with the Bobadal study? Okay. So just like at the very end of that, you actually saw positive pro-social behavior being modeled. It was a really small little ending where people were picking up cans and then the child was engaging in picking up cans and cleaning up the world as well. The idea is that you can model positive behavior. Just as children model negative behavior, they'll model positive behavior as well. There's something called the moral exclusion principle. What this means is basically putting somebody out who doesn't conform to something good. Moral inclusion then is including people who do perform good, right? So it's kind of that double dissociation. The likes get more liked and the disliked become more ostracized. So if you're rewarding or modeling positive moral behavior, what that does then is make you feel more included. And then if you actually give a negative consequence to not helping, that excludes people and makes them feel worse about themselves. So you can kind of get it from both angles, if you will. It's actually the in-group, out-group effect again, right? So moral inclusion, someone does something nice, you put them in your in-group. Somebody doesn't do something nice, you treat them differently and put them in that. I think all of this is pretty straightforward then. Modeling in real life, right? Doing something generous, bringing your children, your friends along, but also modeling in the media too. You see enough positive behavior, especially in television shows. And then learning by doing, because again, remember the basis of conformity, and if you don't want to consider this conformity, is change your behavior, change your attitude. So maybe it's take your friend, take your kid out, make them do something good. You do it enough, it becomes routine. They'll actually become a little bit nicer. Change their attitudes to fit their behavior. And that's it. Look at that, 8:25.
What do you teach next month?
Short answer, I still don't know. Technically, I am teaching intro child development and statistics. all of which you guys have taken, but it may change, and most likely will change to also include cognition, but I know most of you are in cognition already, so.
But that's not for night class,
Probably not, but what they might end up doing is if they don't offer it straight up for night, which I would pick up, they might end up cross-listing it for night. So they'll run it as a day section, the way this is run as a day section, and then they piggyback you guys in on it as a night section. So they oftentimes will do that. That's not really clear yet, because there's too many things that are up in the air between our new hire and then people who are going on sabbatical. So I don't think I'll be seeing any of you again, unless I get put in research methods again, but it's not looking very likely. Looks like research methods for social, which I teach this semester, I've taught this semester, will be taught by Dr. Hojat. She's coming back. Dr. Hojat?
I'm not taking that.
The following semester, who knows what will happen then. Which class is mine? 420, I think Meredith Dove is teaching that. She's one of the new clinical faculty. It's child methodologies. And I think it's basically psychopathology. It's not research methods that you have to take. It's an in-depth course focusing on child techniques. Just happens to have methods in the name. All right, guys.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for being a fun class. Don't be strangers. Email me if anything comes up. Otherwise, I wish everyone the best of luck.
Do you have to take methods before you take a 400 course?
Short answer, yes, but there are some exceptions. So most of the in-depth courses, which are 400s, require methods. There's one or two that technically don't have it listed in COIN as a prerequisite. And I have to look to see which ones those are again, because they always elude me. So you're trying to get into an in-depth without
Well, I have
having taken methods already?